deck buildings and mechanics that have been very successful in the last couple of years, and rightly so, I believe, because it is an extremely interesting mechanics. However, some people sometimes complain that deck building games do not have much interaction between the players, which does not have to be so. It is not something that it is ingrained in the deck building mechanics per se. It is just that many deck building games that came out so far did not have a lot of interaction. Nightfall started changing that, and now we have another deck building game that has a lot of interaction between the players, between the two players, and that game is For the Crown by Victory Point Games. It is also the first deck building game by Victory Point Games, and it also brings something else that is pretty new to the deck building family, which is the tactical aspect. Deck building games do not have much tactical elements, meaning elements that move on a board and then interact with each other based on their relative position. It is more about the sets that you're able to create. Well, not here, because For the Crown is a deck building variant of chess. Imagine this, deck building and chess. Who could think of such a thing? So here, this is a game where the players will be maneuvering pieces on a board in a chess-like fashion, but they will need to build their deck in order to be able to execute certain moves, certain actions, and to acquire new pieces. So I hope you are intrigued, because I believe that the idea is extremely intriguing, so let's take a closer look at the game. To set up the game, the player will place the 4 decks of core cards by the board, and they will also place 10 other decks of cards there. These other decks of cards can be selected among the decks that come with the game. The players may agree on the decks that they want to use, may select them randomly, and of course the fact that the combination of extra decks that you can use in each game will vary from game to game will add replayability to the game. Then each player receives an initial deck of 4 guards and 6 peons. Each player shuffles his deck. Each player then places a king on his side of the board, and at that point the game is ready to start. The cards can produce 3 types of effects: orders, actions, and treasure effects. And as you can see, different cards may produce different combinations of these effects. For example, this card can be played for an order or a treasure effect, this one for an action or treasure, action or another type of action, action or order. The players alternate taking turns. A turn starts with the active player receiving a hand of 5 cards from his deck. Then the player enters the order phase, in which he can execute one of these 4 actions. He can march one of the units that the player has on the board. That means to move the unit into an empty square, following the special rules and restrictions for the way in which each piece moves. Or the player can move a unit into a square that contains an enemy unit. In the case that the enemy unit is eliminated, removed from the board, and again following the restrictions and rules about the movement of each type of unit. Many units will march and attack in the same way. Other units will have 2 different types of movements, one that you had to follow if you want to move the unit into an empty square, and one you had to follow if you want to capture an enemy unit. Another option is to deploy a unit which is in the barracks and to position that unit into one empty square in the first rank on the board. And I will explain later how you get your units into the barracks. Or the player can choose to play a card for its order effect. In the case the player reads the text of the card that was chosen, executes the effect, and then the card has been used for that turn. Then the active player enters the action phase, in which the player can play 1 card with an action effect and resolve the action effect. Now, some actions are normal actions, and the title for those actions is printed in the light blue box. In that case, the player plays the card, resolves the effect, and puts the card in the discard pile. But some other actions are training actions that, as you can see, are labeled by a silver box. Training actions, when taken, will generate the piece that is showed on the card, and the corresponding piece is placed in the barracks of the owning player. But then the card does not go in the discard pile, the card is burnt, is gone forever, eliminated from the game. And in this case, for example, this other card would produce a bishop, but remember, you can only execute one action per turn. That means you can either generate a new piece or you can generate a normal action effect, and then next turn you can spend your order to bring one of your units that are in the barracks onto the board. Then the active player enters the buy phase, during which the active player can use any and all of the cards that he still has in his hand that he hasn't used for orders or actions, and that have a treasure value printed on them. And this is the number of gold coins that the card will produce. In this case, the player has 7 coins, and that gold can be used to purchase any one card among the ones that are still on the table available for purchase, and this is the cost of the card, the cost to purchase the card. In this case, with 7 gold, the player would be able to purchase any one of these cards. The purchase card goes in the discard pile together with all the cards that the player still has in his hand. And traditional deck building style, the player will keep drawing cards from his deck until the deck is exhausted. At that point, the player reshuffles his discard pile and makes a new deck to draw from. So players will keep buying cards, burning cards to bring units into their barracks, bringing units from the barracks onto the board, playing actions to execute several things, and most importantly, moving pieces on the boards using their orders. And the game will continue until a player manages to capture the king of the opponent by moving a unit in the same square as the king is. At that point, that player is the winner. However, let me correct that. The players do not exactly win when they capture the king of the opponent, but when they capture the last king of the opponent. Because each player starts with only one king on the board, but the players may choose to play using the Heir card as one of the optional decks. This card is pretty expensive to buy, but then when a player has it, that card can be burnt as a training action to bring another king into the barracks of the owning player. The king can stay there indefinitely, which is kind of safe. Of course, he cannot be attacked, but the king can also be brought onto the board, and at that point, in order to win the game, the opponent has to be able to eliminate both kings. So it is only when the last king will be removed from the board that the opponent will win. So it's also, so as I said, it's kind of, smart or safe to keep a king there, but then you need to make sure that you bring that king into the board before the other king or whatever the last king on the board is eliminated, because if you end a turn without a king on the board, you still lose the game. Some of the pieces in this game will move and act exactly like the correlative pieces in chess. You have the king that moves to any one adjacent square and can eliminate any enemy unit in any one of those squares. The queen that moves exactly like in chess. The pawn, same thing, can move straight or can attack diagonally. But then you have some other pieces that combine the effect of several pieces from traditional chess. For example, you have the Chancellor that combines the moves of the knight and the rook. So as you can see, he can reach any one of these squares here and eliminate a unit in any one of those. The Dragoon that combines the effects of a king and a knight. So again, he can move in any one of these squares. And then you also have other units that simply move and attack in ways that you do not have in the chess. For example, you have the Warlord that projects this sort of like fields of destruction around himself. The Warlord can move 1 or 2 squares in any combination of directions. So 2 diagonally, or 1 straight and 1 diagonally, 1 diagonal and 1 straight in any one of these directions. Another new one or different one is the Gryphon that always begins its movement by stepping 1 diagonally, but then he can fly straight in and at any distance. So there are just a lot of new options to explore here. From playing this game, I find it deep, involved, complex, demanding. At the end, sometimes I really was physically exhausted. But if you're up for an intellectual challenge, then the game is also extremely rewarding, because again, the game really requires that you invest energy in it. You are playing chess, but with even more variability than in regular chess, because you may have pieces that behave in such a way as you do not see pieces behaving in chess, and you have combinations of pieces that would change from game to game. There will be a game where you have 2 kings on one side, and that same side also has 4 rooks, and the other side has a lot of knights, and actually some special knights that move faster and farther than regular knights. And in another game you will have players using different combinations, so you really have to think out of the chessboard and not just out of the box. And then you had to switch to a deck building system, so just that the multitasking of course requires energy, and the deck building mechanics is really smart, because it has something that I really like in deck building games, which is the option of keeping your deck as thick or as thin as you want. You're not stuck with a huge deck of cards that you do not want, unless you choose to have a thick deck, because you can burn cards to bring pieces onto the board, or just burn cards to bring pieces in your barracks, and then you don't bring it on the board, but you just have a very thin and powerful and effective deck. So that fact, again, you have to switch back and forth, and to optimize these 2 elements, it does take energy, it does take involvement. The length of the game can change greatly depending on the cards that you choose. At first, we have had games that lasted anywhere between an hour and 3.5, I kid you not, but again, it really depends on you. You can customize it any way you want. I like the fact that the game doesn't seem to have any obvious strategy. Maybe there is a way to break the game, but I'm really still far from finding it, because I've seen different types of strategies paying off under different circumstances. Sometimes the most powerful strategies have been based on the board, on a small number of units that were able to perform powerful actions and, you know, cleverly go and sniper down the king of the opponent. Sometimes it has been more based on a powerful deck that then would translate in a huge number of units that are thrown at the opponent like a tsunami, and then you have, you know, just 10 rooks just being thrown at the other side. You sacrifice a rook for a pawn, but then it doesn't matter because you just keep tossing pieces. I have to confess, I'm not much of a subtle player of chess, and this thing of like blunt force is pretty much my strategy, the one that I've used the most, but sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. So that is the good thing. It seems that it really is a game that will allow a lot of different approaches. It's a game that I enjoy, that I really am fascinated by. I have to say that it may not be a crowd pleaser just because it definitely is a brain burner. So I would say, if you are up for a real intellectual challenge that requires concentration and dedication, but it pays off proportionally to the energy that you invest, then I believe that this game may be for you. You may want to give it a try. In any case, I think really it's a game that deserves praise, because it definitely is one of the most original games that I played recently. I don't remember playing any games that feels this way. It does borrow from very familiar games, but it puts them together in such a way that really I had not seen before. So overall, I would say a game that may end up being for not a huge crowd, but it is a game that definitely can give a lot to serious gamers.